Hello, friends. Today's chapter of the day is Mark chapter 15. And chapter 15 is a little dark. Jesus is delivered to Pilate. He has these joke trials. He goes in front of the Sanhedrin, he goes in front of the Jews, then he goes in front of Pilate because the Jews aren't technically supposed to execute anyone, and they definitely want to kill Jesus because he's a threat to their social standing. Uh, and all these things happen. Jesus is mocked and crucified and dies and is buried. And at first blush, it's a really dark chapter in Scripture. But then we look, and in this chapter, we see echoes of things that were said hundreds or even 1,000 years before this happened to Jesus. The first one is Psalm 22, written by David about 1,000 years before Jesus is crucified. And in Psalm 22, we see a couple of things. First, we see verses 16 through 18. This is David writing about what's going to happen to the Messiah. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. So this is David writing about what's going to happen to the Messiah. And then, 300 years or so after David, 700 years still before Jesus, we get Isaiah. And Isaiah writes Isaiah 53, verses 4 through 12. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, and we have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. These are specific references to what's going to happen to Jesus 700 years later. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And they made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death. It's talking about Joseph of Arimathea. Although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. And here's the peak verse of this chapter in my mind. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. Another translation, yet it pleased the Lord to crush him, meaning it pleased the Father to crush the Son. And it goes on in Isaiah to talk about all the things that are foretold that are going to happen to Jesus that we see play out in Mark 15. And there are really two lessons we need to take from this. The first one is to understand that what happened to Jesus was not a surprise, and it was not a change of plans by God. It was the same thing that he planned before time began and started telling people about in the Garden of Eden, and then fulfilled at Golgotha. This has been God's plan from the beginning for his own glory and for our salvation as believers. And the second thing, not only was it not a surprise, but God was in control of every detail of what happened to Jesus on Golgotha. Right down to as Jesus is hanging on the cross and they're casting lots to divide up his garments. God told us 1,000 years beforehand they were going to do that. So there wasn't a point when God let his hands off the wheel, but instead he's walking every step of this, and it's all happening according to his will. Kind of like as we look at Revelation, it's going to seem crazy. It's going to seem out of control. It's going to seem as if evil has won. But God is still 100% in control. And how do we know for sure that Jesus knew that he was fulfilling Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53 and all these other places? Mark 15, verse 34. And at the ninth hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Without any context, it's easy to think Jesus is saying that God turned his back on him and doesn't care about him and has lost control over the situation. Until you go back to Psalm 22, written 1,000 years earlier. And what's the first line of that psalm? My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is saying, I am fulfilling Psalm 22. I am fulfilling Isaiah 53. I am fulfilling all Scripture, which points to him. And in that we should take great comfort, and we should be in awe at the power of God, because even when evil itself thought it was winning, God was still 100% in control, and he was still using what evil perceived to be a victory to be an even greater victory, an ultimate victory over sin and death by the death of Jesus. Mark 15 is a chapter about God's victory. It's a chapter about God's sovereignty. And as you read it, we can understand what Jesus went through on our behalf, and we can feel sad and feel emotions that he would be willing to do that. But we should never feel like he lost control, because this was the pinnacle of God's plan coming to fruition, and we should rejoice that he did it all by himself for our benefit, but for his glory. God bless you all, and I hope this is useful to you.